The silence shattered as whispers began. Henry froze in the middle of Bellini's, a restaurant where a single square meter cost more than a month's rent. He felt the piercing gazes of the elegantly dressed patrons assessing him from head to toe, as if he were a stain on a perfect painting. His hands, those very hands that had shaped extraordinary talents for 40 years, now trembled like autumn leaves, revealing not only his 72 years, but also the illness that was slowly robbing him of his final dignity. Well, look who's here, the old piano teacher from the countryside. The voice of James Thompson, his former student, sounded artificially warm. James, now world famous, flashed the perfect smile that graced the covers of classical music magazines. The humble boy Henry had discovered in a free community class had transformed into a celebrity, navigating the aristocracy of music as if he had always belonged there. "Professor Henry, I'm so glad you accepted my invitation. Please join us." Henry stepped forward, all too aware of his faded navy blue suit, worn-out shoes, and outdated tie. Every step across the red carpet felt like walking on embers. The expensive perfume of the women, the blinding sparkle of jewelry, the clinking of crystal glasses. Everything conspired to remind him that he didn't belong there. At the elegantly set table, 3 unfamiliar faces observed him with thinly veiled curiosity. "So, you're the man who gave our James his first lessons?" asked a woman in her 40s, whose diamond earrings were likely worth more than everything Henry owned. Her tone carried that condescending politeness the wealthy used when speaking to those they considered beneath them. "Yes, I taught James piano for 5 years, Henry said, sitting in the chair offered him, trying to ignore the pain in his joints, before he went to the Vienna Conservatory. "Fascinating." The woman smiled without showing her teeth. "It must be gratifying to see how much he's evolved after those basic first steps." Henry felt the sting behind her words. Basic first steps. As if his 5 years of intensive dedication had been nothing more than a rough sketch before the true masterpiece. "James was always exceptional," Henry replied, maintaining his dignity. "He just needed someone to believe in him when no one else did." A tense silence fell over the table. James cleared his throat and quickly redirected the conversation to his recent European tour, his sold-out concerts, and glowing reviews. Henry watched, torn between genuine pride in his student's success and the pain of being treated with such obvious indifference. The truth was becoming painfully clear. He hadn't been invited as a respected mentor, but as a novelty, a relic from the past, a mere footnote in the brilliant story of James Thompson. "The wine is wonderful, isn't it, Professor?" James interrupted his thoughts. "Actually, I don't drink anymore. My medication doesn't allow it." Another awkward silence. Another moment of discomfort. At that moment, the maitre d' approached, leaning discreetly to speak into James's ear, but loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize, but the restaurant's pianist won't be able to perform tonight. He had an accident on the way here." James frowned. "That's unfortunate. Live music is part of the Bellini's experience." And then came the final blow. The cruel twist that would make this night unforgettable for Henry. "Perhaps your old teacher could delight us with a few notes," suggested one of the men at the table, a gray-haired gentleman with a smile that never reached his eyes. It would be interesting to see where the great James Thompson's journey began. The comment provoked muffled laughter. Henry felt his stomach sink. They didn't want music. They wanted entertainment. They wanted the old teacher's trembling hands fumbling over the keys, so they could later comment on how James had surpassed his humble beginnings. "I don't think that's appropriate," James began, clearly embarrassed. "Professor Henry retired years ago, and—" "I will," Henry interrupted, standing up with sudden determination. Something inside him, perhaps the last trace of the pride that had once defined his career, refused to be an object of pity. A flash of panic crossed James's face. "Professor, you don't have to do this." Henry ignored him, walking toward the magnificent black grand piano at the center of the restaurant. Each step seemed to stretch time. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on his back, the whispers of silent bets on his imminent failure. As he sat on the bench, the worn fabric of his suit clashed violently with the flawless sheen of the instrument. His hands that once danced over keys with a watchmaker's precision, now seemed to betray his will. Henry placed his fingers on the cold ivory. The tremor worsened. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple. The entire restaurant watched, waiting for the spectacle of a broken man's failure. The first chord faltered. His fingers slipped, producing a painful dissonance that lingered in the air like a confession. A muffled chuckle cut through the silence. But then, in that suspended moment between humiliation and despair, something unexpected happened within Henry. A memory, not of notes or technique, but of the pure love for music that had sustained him throughout his life. And his fingers found the keys again. The first chord had failed, but the second was perfect. Henry's hands found their way across the keys like a traveler returning home after decades, rediscovering every path, every hill, every hidden secret in the landscape. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed from his fingers as if time didn't exist, as if arthritis was just an illusion, as if the humiliation of the past few minutes had never happened. The melody wrapped around the restaurant. Conversation ceased. Waiters paused with trays suspended in midair. The malicious laughter faded into a reverent silence. Henry no longer saw the luxury around him. His half-closed eyes traveled through an inner universe where each note told a story, his story. Every chord was a chapter of a life devoted to music, not for applause, not for fame, but for the visceral love of harmonies that could express what words never could. In his mind, he was no longer at Bellini's, but in the small room where, at 7 years old, he had played the piano for the first time. He remembered the smell of polished wood, his mother's smile, the sacrifices his parents made to buy that used upright piano. He recalled the night spent studying by candlelight when they couldn't afford electricity. His hands now glided into an emotional crescendo. The trembling, once an enemy, became part of the interpretation, adding vulnerability and humanity to every phrase. He transitioned from Chopin to his own composition, something he had kept inside for decades. A piece he had never shown anyone. A confession of postponed dreams, lost loves, students who had left, and the loneliness of aging. There was no sheet music. Only Henry's soul, laid bare through the 88 keys. At the table where he'd been ridiculed moments before, James Thompson watched his former teacher with an expression of absolute astonishment. The manufactured smile he wore for magazine covers had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine admiration he hadn't realized still existed beneath the layers of social polish he had accumulated over the years. A lump formed his throat as he recognized fragments of the lessons Henry had taught him so long ago. Not just piano techniques, but lessons on respect for music, artistic integrity, and playing not just with one's fingers, but with an open and vulnerable heart. The woman with the diamond earrings felt something wet slide down her perfectly made-up face. She touched her cheek, surprised to discover they were tears, the first she had shed in years. Something in Henry's music penetrated defenses she had believed impenetrable, reaching a part of herself she had deliberately forgotten. Across the restaurant, similar scenes unfolded. A businessman remembered the violin he had abandoned in his youth to pursue a sensible career. A young woman felt a tightness in her chest, thinking of the grandmother who had raised her and whom she had never properly thanked. A couple in the midst of a silent divorce found themselves holding hands without realizing it. Henry's music wasn't just sound. It was a mirror reflecting truths people preferred to ignore. As his fingers played the final notes, letting them linger in the air like an unanswered question, the silence that followed was absolute. Not even a breath could be heard. It was as if time had been suspended, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell that had enveloped the room. Henry slowly opened his eyes, returning to reality. The weight of the years settled back onto his shoulders. The pain in his joints returned, now sharper from the recent effort. But something had changed in his expression. A recovered dignity, a gleam in his eyes that spoke of silent victory. He rose with difficulty, gently closed the piano lid, and turned to face his impromptu audience. There was no applause, only a silence heavy with emotion. Several people discreetly wiped away tears. Others stared into the distance, lost in memories awakened by the music. James remained motionless, his face a mass of conflicting emotions. Henry walked slowly toward the exit. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated to preserve his newly reclaimed dignity. As he passed the table where he had been humiliated, he felt a hand grip his wrist. It was James, now standing, his face transformed. "Professor," he began, his voice thick with emotion, almost unrecognizable. I never... Henry looked into his former student's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. And in that gaze, the first revelation of a painful truth. James Thompson was just as lost as any of them, perhaps even more. "Can we talk?" James whispered, his eyes pleading. "In private." Henry hesitated. The quiet triumph still pulsed through his veins, but the old pain, the pain of abandonment, remained alive. "My taxi should be waiting," Henry replied, trying to pull his wrist free. "Please," James insisted. And for the first time that night, his voice sounded genuine, stripped of the affectation he had adopted as a second skin. "Just 5 minutes." Henry reluctantly nodded. The two men walked to the restaurant's small indoor garden, a reserved space where the starry night contrasted with Bellini's artificial lights. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, mingling with the distant aroma of sophisticated dishes. "Your music," James began, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, now slightly disheveled by emotion. "I've never heard anything so honest," Henry completed, without bitterness. "That's what happens when you play to express, not to impress." James received the words like a physical blow. His defenses, built over years of rising to stardom, began to crumble. He took a few steps back, as if needing space to breathe under the weight of the truth. "You think I've lost my way," he said, not as a question, but as a painful realization. Henry didn't respond immediately. He observed the man before him, not James Thompson, the poster boy virtuoso, but a 12-year-old boy who had secretly cried after class when the other students mocked his second-hand clothes and ambitious dreams. "I think we all lose our way sometimes, James," he finally answered. "The difference is, some of us realize it." A heavy silence settled between them. The physical distance was small, less than 2 meters, but the emotional chasm seemed insurmountable. Years of unspoken stories, divergent paths, choices that had shaped two vastly different destinies. "Why did you invite me, James? After all these years?" The question hung in the air like a dissonant note, waiting for resolution. James averted his gaze, focusing on the ornamental plants in the garden. His fingers, the same ones that enchanted audiences in packed theaters, drummed nervously against his thigh, as if seeking the comfort of an absent keyboard. "I'm losing sensation in my fingertips," he finally confessed, his voice barely audible. "Peripheral neuropathy, the doctors say, progressive and irreversible." The revelation hit Henry like a cold wave. Peripheral neuropathy, a death sentence for a pianist. How long? 8 months. I started noticing it during rehearsals for my last tour. Wrong notes, struggling with passages I used to play effortlessly. James let out a bitter laugh. "No one else has noticed yet. I can compensate with technique, with tricks I've developed. But I know, and it's getting worse." A deep compassion grew in Henry's chest. Not for the celebrated pianist, but for the boy who had once dreamed of making music that touched souls. "My agent only knows I want a break. The doctors recommended fewer performances, maybe teaching. And then I thought of you." James finally looked his old mentor in the eyes. "I wanted to see if there was still something I could learn, something beyond technique, something that might help me face what's coming. So you brought me to this circus?" Henry gestured toward the restaurant. "To put me on display as some relic from your past?" "No." James shook his head, regret evident in his eyes. "I didn't plan this. I just wanted a quiet dinner, maybe an honest conversation. But when you arrived, I panicked. I became that insecure boy again, desperate to prove his worth. I wanted to show how much I had achieved, how far I had come. It was childish and cruel. And now, Henry asked, feeling the weight of his years, the exhaustion of a life devoted to an art that demands everything but rarely gives back in equal measure. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a female voice interrupted. "There you are." The woman with the diamond earrings approached, her elegant stride at odds with the slightly red-rimmed eyes of someone who had been crying. She stopped beside James, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "Your performance was extraordinary, Professor," she said, the previous condescension replaced with something closer to reverence. James never told us his first mentor was so talented. Henry nodded in silent acknowledgement, noticing the slight tension in James's shoulders at the woman's touch. We were just discussing the possibility of Professor Henry giving a few private lessons. James improvised, forcing a smile. Maybe an exclusive workshop for select guests. The woman lit up at the idea. That would be divine. We could host it at our country house. A weekend of classical music with 2 brilliant pianists. She squeezed James's arm. "You owe me after the Zurich fiasco." A flicker of panic crossed James's face, so quick that only Henry, who had known him since childhood, could have noticed. "Victoria, I don't think now is the time to—" "Zurich fiasco?" Henry asked, sensing that something important was hidden in the subtext of this conversation. Victoria laughed, a crystalline sound as sharp as broken glass. "Oh, James is so modest about his little slip-ups." That missed note in Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, almost imperceptible to most, but fatal to purists. "Isn't that right, darling?" James's face paled under the soft garden lights. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, met Henry's with a silent plea. Not for pity, but for understanding. "It was just a minor technical mistake," James explained, his voice betraying the anguish he was trying to suppress. "It happens to every pianist eventually." Victoria let out a delicate laugh, adjusting one of her diamond earrings. "Darling, don't be modest." The critic from the Vienna Herald said it was the first sign of the inevitable decline all artists face. She turned to Henry, leaning in as if sharing a valuable secret. Tickets for his upcoming concerts are already selling at higher prices. People want to see James Thompson while he still has his magic. Every word pierced James's chest like a thin, invisible needle. Henry watched the small contractions in his former student's face. Telltale signs only a dedicated mentor would recognize. "Victoria," James interrupted, his voice now firm, "could you give us a moment?" A flash of irritation crossed the perfectly composed woman's face, but it was quickly replaced by a practiced smile. "Of course, darling. I'll be at the table." She touched Henry's arm as she passed. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Professor. Your music—" She hesitated, searching for words. "Your music reminded me why I fell in love with classical music in the first place." As Victoria walked away, silence enveloped the two men once more. Henry felt the weight of the moment. The brilliant student and the old teacher, united not only by the past, but by a painfully similar present. The gradual loss of the one thing that truly defined them. "It's not just a slip-up, is it?" Henry asked softly. James shook his head, unable to maintain the facade any longer. "It started with small mistakes. Notes I would never miss. Then I realized I wasn't feeling the keys the same way." He lifted his hands, examining them as if they were foreign objects. "These fingers have always been more mine than any other part of me, and now they're betraying me." Henry felt a deep ache for the man before him. For a pianist, losing sensation in his fingers was like a painter gradually going blind. A cruel and ironic fate. "What did the doctor say?" Henry asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "They say I have to accept it." James let out a bitter laugh, as if it were possible to accept that everything I fought for is slipping through my numb fingers. A waiter appeared at the garden entrance, hesitating when he noticed the intensity of their conversation. "Mr. Thompson, your guests are asking if you'd like dessert to be served." James waved a hand dismissively without looking at the man. In a moment, when they were alone again, James turned to Henry, his eyes shining with a vulnerability that reminded Henry of the 12-year-old boy he used to be. "Victoria is my manager," James admitted, "and occasionally something more when it benefits both of our careers. She's planning my final grand world tour before I can no longer hide the problem." "Does she know about the diagnosis?" "She knows enough to profit from it." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. The story of a pianist at his peak, giving one last breathtaking performance, sells more tickets than I ever could. Henry took a few steps, feeling the strain of his own years. Every movement brought a familiar ache in his knees, his back, the aged body protesting against motion, just as James's fingers now protested against music. "When you left my lessons," Henry began carefully, "I thought I had failed as a teacher." James looked at him, surprised. "You? Fail? You were the only one who believed in me when even my own parents didn't." "It wasn't enough," Henry replied, his voice carrying an old sadness. "I wanted to teach you about music, about technique, about playing perfectly. But I forgot to teach you how to live with music, even when it feels out of reach." The wind stirred the leaves in the garden, bringing with it fragments of the restaurant's background music, a lifeless recording that only highlighted the emptiness left by Henry's performance. "It's not too late," Henry said, placing a trembling hand on James's shoulder. "To learn, to teach, to rediscover why we fell in love with music in the first place." James's eyes filled with unshed tears. "And if I can't play anymore, who is James Thompson without a piano?" The question hung between them, heavy with fear and possibilities. "Maybe it's time to find out," Henry answered gently. "It took me 72 years to understand that I am more than what my hands can do. Maybe you don't have to wait that long." At that moment, another waiter approached, this time with more urgency. "Mr. Thompson, forgive the intrusion, but there's someone here insisting on seeing you. A young woman. She says she's your daughter." The shock on James's face was immediate and absolute. "I don't have a daughter," he replied automatically, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. "She insists, sir. She says her name is Emily Carter, and that her mother was Sarah Carter." Henry watched the transformation in James's face, the recognition, the fear, the guilt. In an instant, all pretenses collapsed, revealing a man facing not just a loss of his career, but the ghost of a past he had deliberately abandoned. "Sarah," James whispered, the name escaping like an involuntary confession. Henry felt the weight of the revelation. There were more untold stories, more buried pains beneath the polished surface of the famous pianist than he had ever imagined. "Where is she?" James's voice faltered, barely recognizable even to himself. The waiter gestured toward the restaurant's entrance. "She's in the lobby, sir. We asked her to wait, per protocol." Henry watched as James's expression twisted, panic, recognition, and guilt entwined the face of a man seeing his past materialize at the most unexpected moment. "Sarah Carter," James murmured almost inaudibly, 20 years ago, before Vienna. James's eyes searched Henry's, desperate for some kind of anchor. "I need to go," James said, adjusting his jacket with trembling hands. "Victoria can't know. No one can know. We all have untold stories, James," Henry said gently. "Some of them find us when we least expect it." James placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, a rare, vulnerable gesture. "Professor Henry, please stay. I don't know what I'm about to face, but I know I don't want to face it alone." The two men walked side by side down the hallway. With each step, Henry could feel James stiffening, like a piano string stretched to its limit. And then she was there, a young woman around 20, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a simple bun, her modest clothing starkly contrasting with the opulence of Bellini's. In her hands, she clutched a worn envelope. Her eyes, identical to James's, Henry realized, locked onto penis, unwavering and free of awe. James Thompson? Her voice was steady, despite the slight tremor of emotion beneath it. Yes, James answered, his face a mask concealing the storm within. My name is Emily Carter. Sarah Carter was my mother. The past tense made James's face go pale. The word escaped like a dissonant note. She passed away 3 months ago. Cancer. Emily delivered the information without embellishment. Her last weeks were spent organizing her belongings. That's when I found this. She extended the envelope toward him. James stared at it, as if it were something dangerous. What is this? He asked, making no move to take it. Letters. Your letters to her. And DNA test results she never sent. Emily kept the envelope outstretched. She never wanted to disrupt your career. She never asked for anything, but she thought I had the right to know the truth. The entire lobby had gone silent. Staff members pretended to be busy, but all eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama. I don't want your money, Emily continued. I don't want your name. I just want to see your face once, give you this, and go on with my life. Henry observed James, the man who performed before thousands without a shred of nervousness, now completely paralyzed before this young woman. His right hand trembled visibly. Sarah never... James started, but the words dissolved. She never told you, Emily finished for him. She found out when you were already in Vienna. She decided your future was more important than complications. The word complications hung in the air, painfully honest. Do you play? James's question surprised everyone. Emily blinked, momentarily disarmed. Piano? No. Cello. Mom insisted. She said I had your hands. James looked at the young woman's hands, long fingers, elegant, perfectly shaped for a string instrument. His own hands, reproduced with eerie precision. And are you good? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm in my second year at the Municipal Conservatory, Emily answered with quiet pride. Nothing compared to the great James Thompson, of course. There was a hint of bitterness in that last phrase, the first indication of years of absence, of questions left unanswered. A manager approached discreetly. Mr. Thompson, your guests are asking about you. Ms. Harrington seems particularly restless. Victoria, the woman orchestrating James's grand farewell tour, strategically marketing his decline. Tell them I had an emergency. James said, not breaking eye contact with Emily. Cancel dessert. Settle the bill. He finally took the envelope from her hands, holding it close to his chest. You said you just wanted to see me once, James said, his voice gaining weight. But I'd like to hear you play, if that's possible. The proposal hung between them, father and daughter, strangers bound by blood and 20 years of silence. Emily hesitated, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Distrust, curiosity, a reluctant flicker of hope. Why? She finally asked. Why now? The question carried more weight than the words alone could convey. Why care after 20 years? Why open a door that could complicate the carefully crafted image of James Thompson, the virtuoso pianist? James looked down at his own hands that were slowly losing the sensitivity that had built his fame. Because I'm learning too late that some music needs to be heard before silence becomes permanent. Henry's apartment had never hosted such unexpected guests. Seated on the small, worn-out couch, James and Emily form an image of uncanny resemblance. The same eyes, the same hands, the same way they tilted their heads slightly when listening intently. The physical distance between them, mere inches, felt as vast as the 20 years that had separated them. It's not luxurious, but it's home, Henry said, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups that rarely left the cupboard. His hands trembled more than usual, not just from arthritis, but from the intensity of the moment unfolding before him. It's cozy, Emily replied, her gaze roaming the shelves crammed with sheet music, old photographs of students, and the piano that dominated the small space. Mom would have loved this place. Sarah's name lingered in the air like an unresolved note, forcing James to confront the weight of his past choices. Do you have pictures of her? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. From the last few years, Emily hesitated, then reached into her simple handbag. She pulled out a few carefully preserved photographs. She handed them to James without a word. Henry watched as his former student's face transformed upon seeing the woman he had once loved, now marked by time and illness, yet still possessing that same smile that had apparently captivated young James before Vienna, before fame, before everything. She never married, Emily said, her voice softening for the first time. She always said music was her great love. And me, of course. James held the photos as if they were fragile sheet music of immeasurable value. She was a pianist too. That's how we met, at the community school where Henry taught. Henry was taken aback. Sarah Carter, the red-haired girl who quit in her second year? She didn't quit, James corrected, a sad smile forming. She realized I had more talent and decided to support me instead. She worked 2 jobs to help me pay for the extra lessons you gave. The revelation hit Henry like a physical blow. All these years, he had believed James had earned the scholarship purely on merit, when in reality... Why didn't you ever tell me? Henry asked, because she made me promise not to. She said your talent shouldn't carry the weight of gratitude, only the responsibility of excellence. Emily observed the exchange, absorbing fragments of a history that was also hers, filling in the gaps of her own existence. She took me to see you play once, Emily suddenly said. I was 12, in Paris. We sat in the last row because it was all we could afford. James looked at her, stunned. You were there? Why didn't you come see me after? She said it would be selfish to disturb your concentration. Emily smiled sadly, but she brought the program for you to sign. We waited almost 2 hours in the autograph line, but when our turn came, you had already left. Silence settled over the room, heavy with missed moments, encounters that never happened, and words left unsaid. Henry slowly stood and walked to the piano. I think you two need to talk. And maybe to do that, you need the right language. His fingers, trembling but determined, began to play a simple lullaby he used to teach his beginner students. The melody filled the small apartment, creating a space where difficult words could finally find their way. James recognized the melody instantly. It was the first piece Henry had ever taught him. Almost instinctively, he moved toward the piano, sitting beside his former teacher. His hands found the keys, complementing Henry's melody, transforming the simple tune into an improvised duet. You still play well, Henry remarked, noticing how James adapted his technique to compensate for the gradual loss of sensation. I'm learning to play differently, James responded, to feel the music beyond my fingers. Emily watched, mesmerized by the silent conversation unfolding between the two pianists. There was something profoundly intimate in that moment. Not just technique, but an unspoken dialogue that transcended generations. You brought your cello? James asked suddenly, interrupting the melody. Emily nodded, pointing to the instrument case leaning near the door, so subtly placed that no one had noticed his presence until now. Play with us, Henry invited, his eyes glinting with a sudden idea. Music has always been the language of this family, even when you didn't know you were one. Emily hesitated, her face a blend of emotions, desire, fear, hope. I'm not as good as you, she murmured. No one is judging you here, James replied, shifting to make space for her. We just want to hear your voice in the only language that truly matters to us. In that small apartment, under the soft glow of an old lamp, 3 generations of musicians found each other in the only space where their pain, hopes, and love could truly be expressed, not in words, but in notes that transcended time and regrets. The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of Henry's apartment, casting a golden light over the unusual trio who had fallen asleep in makeshift positions after a night filled with music. Emily lay curled up on the worn couch, James on the old pull-out bed, and Henry in his favorite rocking chair, a thin blanket over his knees. Emily woke first, her eyes scanning the small space with newfound understanding. The photos on the walls now carried meaning, snapshots of a life dedicated to teaching others to find their own voices through music. One picture caught her attention. A young James, his hair unruly, eyes shining with ambition, standing beside a red-haired girl. Her mother and her father, together, before life had separated them. He's kept that picture for over 20 years. Henry's voice was soft, like the first notes of a morning melody. Even when James stopped visiting, I never had the heart to take it down. Emily traced the outline of her mother's face through the glass, her fingers delicate. She never blamed him, you know? She always said some people are born to light up the world, and it would be selfish to confine that light to one place. Henry adjusted himself in his chair, his tired eyes still sharp. Sarah was wise beyond her years, and you seem to have inherited that from her. And my father's stubbornness, Emily added with a small smile, glancing at James, who was still asleep. The previous night had been a journey through time. As Emily's cello spoke to James and Henry's piano, invisible barriers had begun to crumble. There had been no grand declarations or promises, only the quiet realization that, despite everything, a connection existed between them. The soft sound of conversation stirred James awake. For a moment, confusion clouded his face. This was not a luxurious hotel suite, and these were not the people he was accustomed to waking up with. Then the memories of the night before returned, bringing with them an unfamiliar sense of peace. "Good morning," he said, sitting up. "What time is it?" "Almost 9, Henry answered. "I made coffee. Not as sophisticated as Bellini's, but it's honest." James smiled at the simplicity of the offering. The best kind of coffee. The three of them sat at the small kitchen table, steaming cups in hand, the silence between them no longer heavy, but comfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who no longer feel need to fill every moment with words. "I have a concert in Vienna next week," James finally said. "Probably my last major performance before." His gaze dropped to his hands, those hands that no longer responded as they once did. "Before the press finds out about the neuropathy." Henry finished for him. James nodded. "Victoria is already planning my farewell tour. A grand finale, she calls it. Tickets at astronomical prices to see James Thompson while he can still play." "And that's not what you want," Emily observed, not as a question, but as a statement. "I don't know what I want anymore," James admitted, turning his coffee cup between his fingers. "I've spent so long being what others expected. The prodigy, the virtuoso, the name on a theater marquise, that I've forgotten who I am when I'm not playing." Henry placed his wrinkled hand over James's. "Maybe it's time to find out." James met Emily's gaze. "I'd like you to come to Vienna." "To the concert?" Surprise flickered across her face. "Me?" "You and Professor Henry. Not as part of the audience, but as my family." James took a deep breath, as if summoning courage. "And afterward, if you want, I'd like to hear you play at your conservatory. To know your life, your friends, your dreams." Emily lowered her gaze to her coffee, emotions warring in her expression. "I don't know if I can just forgive." James guessed. "Forget the years I wasn't there." He shook his head. "I'm not asking that. I'm just asking for a chance to know Sarah's daughter. The music that continued even after I left." Henry watched the exchange, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was like watching a complex composition finally find its resolution, not perfect, still with unresolved harmonies, but moving towards something whole. "I'll have to think about it," Emily finally said. "This is a lot." James nodded, respecting the space she needed. "That's fair." Henry stood, moving toward the piano. His fingers, stiff from arthritis and age, rested on the keys as if greeting old friends. "You know what I've learned in 72 years," he said. softly playing a simple melody. That our hands may fail us, our bodies may betray us, but music, the real kind, never leaves us. James joined him on the piano bench, picking up where Henry left off, turning the melody into something richer, fuller. Emily watched, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Maybe I could go to Vienna, she murmured, almost to herself, just to listen. In the small apartment, surrounded by faded photographs and yellowed sheet music, three people bound by an invisible thread of music found a new beginning. There are no guarantees, no grand promises, just the possibility of a new chord, a new melody that honored both the past and the future. When James finally left to face the world, Victoria, the farewell tour of the press, and all the complications awaiting him, he carried something that money and fame could never buy. The understanding that his legacy wasn't just in the recordings or the reviews, but in the hearts he had touched. And as Henry watched his former student walk down the street, he felt a quiet certainty settle within him. Sometimes, the most beautiful music comes not when the hands are flawless, but when the heart finally learns the true language of the notes. Did you enjoy this emotional story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you liked it and want more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us grow and bring more inspiring tales to you. See you in the next story.